In the quiet coastal city of Cape Coral, life had always moved at a gentle pace. Palm trees swayed against the warm breeze, and the rhythm of daily routines rarely broke the stillness of the night. It was a place where families felt safe, where neighbors trusted each other, and where the idea of evil creeping into a home felt like something that only happened somewhere far away. But on one devastating spring night, that illusion shattered forever. This is the story of an ordinary evening that turned into a lifelong nightmare, a crime that baffled detectives for more than a quarter of a century, and the moment when a small trace of DNA, left behind by a killer who believed he had escaped, finally answered the question that haunted a mother every day of her life. Welcome back to Darkcasedesk. If you find these deep dive documentaries important, please like, comment, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And remember, this is a real case involving real people, and their loved ones are still living with the pain of what happened. Tonight, we revisit one of Florida's most disturbing cases, the murders of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and 32-year-old Lisa Story, a case that remained unsolved for more than 26 years before a single unexpected event finally cracked it open. Our story begins decades before the truth was known, in the late 1980s, when a hard-working single mother named Jan Cornell made the difficult decision to uproot her life in search of something better. Jan had raised her two daughters largely on her own. Their father was not an active presence, leaving her with the responsibility and privilege of shaping her daughters' futures through her own hands. Her older daughter eventually moved out to pursue her education, but her younger daughter, Robin, still lived with her. Robin had been born on the 30th of November in 1978 in Florida. She was a bright-eyed, kind-hearted child who seemed to see beauty everywhere, in nature, in animals, and in the people around her. She was small, energetic, always exploring, and always helping. Once she found an injured bird and nursed it back to health until it could fly again. That was the kind of child Robin was, gentle, compassionate, curious. When Robin was about 10 years old, Jan made the decision to move to the serene town of Cape Coral. The move represented a fresh start, a chance to build a calmer, more stable life. Jan quickly got a job at a local hospital, and the townhouse she found was just a few minutes' walk from her workplace. To her relief, Robin adapted beautifully. She made new friends easily, joined school activities, played sports, and explored the area with her typical adventurous spirit. Life was hard, yes, but it was good, and for a short time it felt like everything was finally falling into place. Around this time, Jan also met a man named Donald, and the two began dating. After years devoted entirely to mothering, working, and surviving, Jan finally had a chance to enjoy companionship again. She also befriended a co-worker at the hospital, a woman named Lisa Story. Lisa was quiet, responsible, and kind-hearted. Over time, the two became close friends. In early May of 1990, Jan learned that Lisa was having trouble affording rent on her own. Wanting to help and grateful for the help Lisa gave with Robin, Jan invited her to move in. Their two-story townhouse had a spare room, and splitting rent made financial sense for both of them. Lisa moved in within the week. She and Robin got along immediately. In fact, Lisa even agreed to babysit Robin whenever Jan needed help. On the evening of May 9th, just 1 week after Lisa moved in, Jan made plans to visit her boyfriend, Donald, and watch a televised game with him. She initially hesitated. Something about leaving Robin for the whole evening felt off. Not dangerous, not alarming, just uneasy. A mother's instinct. But Lisa reassured her. She insisted that it was no trouble and that she was happy to watch Robin. So Jan left for Donald's place sometime that evening. She believed she would return home within a few hours, but fate had other plans. Jan ended up falling asleep in front of the television. By the time she woke up, it was already around 3 in the morning. Alarmed, she quickly gathered her things and drove home, hoping Robin and Lisa had gone to bed without any trouble. But the moment she reached her front door, her concern grew into something deeper. Fear, confusion, dread. The front door was locked with both locks. Jan had only given Lisa one key, the key to the top lock. So why was the bottom lock engaged? As she fumbled with her keys, she heard footsteps inside, quick, light, fading. Someone was in the house, but they were not coming to let her in. She knocked, she called out. No response. Growing increasingly anxious, Jan hurried around the back of the townhouse, hoping the sliding door might still be open. To her surprise and terror, it was. Slightly open, letting the night air drift inside. At this point, the sky was still dark, the world was silent. And inside the house, her daughter should have been sleeping peacefully. But Jan felt that something was terribly, terribly wrong. When she stepped into the kitchen, her confusion turned into horror. Family photos, pictures of Robin and her older sister were neatly arranged on an ironing board. These photos normally hung on the living room wall. Why were they suddenly moved and placed on display like some kind of message? And the house was in complete disarray. Items scattered, broken, misplaced. Signs of a struggle, signs of violence. Heart-pounding, Jan rushed upstairs. Her daughter's bedroom door was open, and what she saw inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Robin lay face down on the floor beside her bed, her small body bruised, her clothing pulled out of place. When Jan touched her, she realized instantly that her daughter was cold. Even though she knew, deep down, she knew that Robin was gone, she still tried to wake her, tried to save her, tried to hold on to even the slightest possibility that this nightmare could be undone. But it couldn't. Panicked, trembling, she called emergency services. Her voice echoed through the neighborhood, waking neighbors with her cries for help. Some opened their windows, some came outside, but no one could change what had already happened. When police arrived, they confirmed the unthinkable. Robin was dead, but she was not the only victim. In another bedroom, officers discovered 32-year-old Lisa Story lying lifeless on the bed. She too had visible bruises. She too had been attacked, brutalized, murdered. Within minutes, the home was transformed into a crime scene. Detectives searched for clues and found several strange and chilling details. There were cigarette butts in the house, none belonging to Jan or Lisa. On Jan's bedroom nightstand, police found a set of Toyota car keys belonging to no one in the home. It seemed the killer either left them behind accidentally or intentionally. Then came an even more disturbing discovery. In Lisa's bedroom, detectives found a pair of socks that did not belong to any resident. Why would the killer remove his socks? Why leave them behind? And then detectives realized something else. The killer had taken a shower inside the home after the murders. Water droplets still clung to the tiles. The curtain was wet, and the killer had left the bathroom as if he had tried to wash guilt from his skin, but had no idea the evidence he accidentally left behind would one day betray him. Even the items stolen from the home were unusual. Lisa's credit cards, her checkbook, her driver's license, a watch she had planned to give to her boyfriend, a watch engraved with her personal message. Nothing valuable, nothing profitable, only personal, sentimental items. Was he taunting someone, sending a message, or was he simply careless? Then there were the photographs of Robin, placed neatly on the ironing board, almost like a display. Why would the killer do that? Was he trying to intimidate Jan? Was he trying to tell police something? Or was it simply part of his twisted ritual? At this early stage, detectives didn't know. They only knew they were dealing with someone who had taken his time, someone who had moved around the home freely, confidently, and without fear of being caught. As investigators searched the house, forensic teams carefully examined the bedrooms. On Robin's bedsheets and pillow, they found biological material, fresh biological material, left by the perpetrator. They also extracted a sample from Robin's body. When the results finally came back, they confirmed something crucial. 3 separate DNA samples, from the pillow, from the sheet, and from Robin herself, all belonged to the same man. But there was a bigger problem. His DNA wasn't in any database, no match, no name, no identity. Investigators were hunting a ghost. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, detectives chased every possible lead. Jan told investigators that for the past 3 nights before the murders, she had been awakened by strange noises, someone opening the gate, someone tampering with the sliding door. She even recalled waking up one morning and seeing a man standing outside her window. He smiled at her and then vanished out of sight. Had this man been stalking them, watching them, waiting for the perfect night? Detectives canvassed the townhouse complex and nearby neighborhoods, interviewing anyone who might have seen something or someone suspicious. Some neighbors offered DNA samples voluntarily, others refused. Among them was a man known for peeping into windows. Suspicious, yes. Guilty, maybe. But police could not connect him to the crime, and his DNA did not match. Another neighbor reported seeing an unfamiliar car circling the complex the day before the murders. A man wearing a red cap was behind the wheel, but police could not identify him either. Then came a bizarre clue: the Toyota keys found inside the house. Investigators spent months checking owners of Toyota vehicles from the 1980s, but nothing connected. Every path led nowhere. Every suspect led to a dead end. Every trace of hope seemed to fade. The case slowly grew cold, and yet, Jan never stopped fighting. She gave interviews. She pleaded with the public. She begged anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. But for 15 long years, nothing changed. Then in 2005, the case was officially reopened. A detective was assigned exclusively to the investigation for 6 months. He read thousands of pages of old reports, re-examined evidence, chased new leads, all of which collapsed again. Another year passed, and another, and another. 2 decades after the murders, the case seemed permanently frozen in time until August of 2016. In a twist no one expected, everything changed because of a completely unrelated arrest: an assault involving an air rifle committed by a man living just 6 miles away. When this man's DNA was submitted to the state database, a match appeared, a perfect match. The killer's identity was finally revealed. For more than a quarter of a century, the murders of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and 32-year-old Lisa Story remained one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Florida's history. Generations of detectives came and went. New forensic technology emerged. But every time the evidence was tested, every time a suspect was interviewed, every time hope flickered, nothing happened. No matches, no leads, no justice. By the time the year 2016 arrived, the case seemed anchored in a painful, unbreakable past. Jan, Robin's mother, had spent decades waiting for answers. She had grown older, but not weaker. She never stopped asking, never stopped pushing, never stopped carrying the last memories of her daughter like a weight she refused to set down. She had lived with the image of that night for more than 26 years, the photos arranged on the ironing board, the wet shower curtain, the cigarette butts that didn't belong, the socks left behind, the horrifying stillness in her daughter's room. That night did not fade with time. It replayed every day. It replayed every night. It was a wound that never healed. But fate has a strange way of moving events when no one expects it. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive on time. It arrives through coincidence, through something small, something routine, something entirely unrelated to the case itself. And that is exactly what happened in the late summer of 2016. Just a few miles from Jan's old townhouse, police responded to a domestic incident involving a middle-aged man and his adult son. The man had attacked his son using an air rifle, and although the injuries were not severe, the law required something important. The suspect was obligated to provide a DNA sample for the offender database. This man, arrested on an entirely unrelated charge, had no idea that the moment his DNA touched a swab, his life, and the lives of everyone connected to the Cornell and Story families, would change forever. When the forensic lab processed the sample, the computer system flagged it instantly. It was not a partial hit. It was not a close relative. It was a perfect 100% match to the biological material taken from 3 different locations inside Jan's townhouse 26 years earlier, from Robin's bedding, from her pillow, and from her body. The man's identity was now undeniable. His name was Joseph Zieler. He had been 28 years old at the time of the murders. At the time of his arrest in 2016, he was 54. He had a criminal record, but nothing like what detectives expected from someone capable of such brutality: petty theft, an illegal firearm. Prison time, yes, but not violent felonies. Nothing that would have triggered mandatory DNA collection in the early 1990s. For more than 2 decades, his DNA sat untouched in old evidence boxes while he walked free, lived his life, fathered a child, and carried on without ever being connected to the horrifying night of May 9, 1990. The match was irrefutable. Detectives immediately requested a direct DNA swab from Zieler, ensuring there was no possibility of lab contamination or error. The second sample matched perfectly as well. All 3 original crime scene samples, preserved for more than a generation, belonged to him. The ghost had a name. When investigators learned where he lived in 1990, they realized something chilling. He had not lived in a distant city or an unreachable location. He had lived in a neighboring town close enough to Cape Coral that he could access the area easily. He had never appeared on suspect lists, never raised red flags, never made statements to police. He was invisible to the investigation. Within days of receiving the match, authorities prepared an arrest warrant. The announcement brought tears, disbelief, and tremors through both victims' families. After 26 years of silence, the case was suddenly alive again. When deputies confronted Zieler, he denied everything, but the DNA spoke louder than he ever could. It tied him to Robin. It tied him to her bed. It tied him to her pillow. It tied him to the crime scene more clearly than fingerprints or eyewitness testimony ever could. The prosecution quickly made their intentions clear. They would pursue the death penalty. But long before a courtroom heard the evidence, long before a jury sat in their chairs, long before the world watched him melt down in one of the most shocking trial performances in recent memory, investigators needed to piece together the missing parts of the story. Who was this man? Where had he been that night? Why did he target this home? Why take the sentimental items from Lisa's room? Why move the photos? Why shower inside the home? Why take his time? And more importantly, why did he choose them? Interviews with those who had known him painted a picture of a man who was volatile, unpredictable, manipulative, and capable of sudden violence. His past relationships revealed red flags that no one connected at the time. He had committed burglaries, he had stolen items with little value, he had been arrested for petty crimes, he had been in and out of different towns, he had carried a weapon illegally, and yet, nothing about his record suggested that he could commit a double homicide. But DNA does not lie. The science that did not exist in 1990 now served as an unbreakable witness, pointing directly at Zieler. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors built a detailed timeline of what they believed happened on the night of the murders. They believed Zieler entered the townhouse through a window on the first floor after cutting the protective screen. They believed he encountered Lisa first. They believed he overpowered her, assaulted her, and killed her using a pillow. They believed he then moved to Robin's room, where he attacked the 11-year-old child, inflicted multiple injuries, and ultimately ended her life as well. Forensic evidence supported this sequence. Biological material found on Robin's bed and pillow indicated that Zieler had moved back and forth between the rooms. The wet shower curtain showed he had stayed long after the murders to wash himself. The socks found inside the room suggested he had removed them for reasons unknown. The cigarette butts indicated he smoked inside the home, comfortable, unhurried, disturbingly relaxed. The house had not been ransacked for valuables. It had not been searched for money. It had not been accessed for robbery. This was personal, intentional, and absolutely monstrous. As detectives reconstructed the night, another troubling possibility emerged. Zieler may have been watching the townhouse long before May 9th. John's memories of hearing the gate open, of hearing the sliding door move, and of seeing a man staring into her window aligned with behavioral patterns often seen in predatory offenders. He had been testing the home, testing the access points, testing the timing. And on the one night Jan left Robin for more than a short period, he struck. When the news of Zieler's arrest reached Jan, she cried, not with relief, but with a complicated mix of emotions that only a mother who has waited half her life could understand. Nothing could bring Robin back. Nothing could erase the trauma. Nothing could undo the nightmares. But finally, the killer had a name. Lisa's family reacted with similar grief and gratitude. Her sister described the news as the moment we have waited decades for, while others expressed shock that someone so close by had been overlooked for so long. But the journey to justice was far from over. Because Zieler refused to plead guilty, he refused to acknowledge the DNA, he refused to admit being in the home, he refused to accept responsibility for either murder. And as the years passed, the world watched the case approach trial. The pandemic slowed the process. Legal motions delayed it further. Zieler changed lawyers, requested psychological evaluations, filed appeals, and used every legal strategy available to prolong the inevitable. 7 long years passed between his arrest and the day he finally stepped into a courtroom. The trial began in early May of 2023, almost exactly 33 years after the murders. Journalists packed the room, true crime followers across the country tuned in, and families who had waited half a lifetime sat, listening to the unfolding of the evidence they had lived with for so long. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement. They described the crime in clear detail. They described how Zieler cut the window screen, how he entered with purpose, how he attacked Lisa first, how he brutalized Robin, how he stayed in the house long after both victims were dead. Then they unveiled the centerpiece of the case, the 3 DNA samples that all matched Zieler with absolute scientific certainty. The jurors listened. Some cried. Some shook their heads in disbelief, but all of them understood what the evidence meant. Then came the moment the courtroom was not prepared for. When Zieler took the stand, he erupted into one of the most chaotic displays ever seen in a modern true crime trial. Instead of offering explanations, he berated the jurors, insulted the prosecution, cursed at his own attorneys, and launched into bizarre rants that left everyone stunned. And when asked how his DNA ended up on Robin's bedding, pillow, and body, he gave an explanation so offensive, so implausible, and so easily disproven that the courtroom gasped. He claimed he had slept with Jan, Robin's mother, months before the murders, and that the DNA had remained on her bedding all that time. It was a lie, a cruel one. Jan had never met him, never seen him, never spoken to him. And the forensic expert explained in detail that the biological material was fresh on the night of the murders, not months old. But Zieler didn't stop. He called Jan degrading names. He shouted that she was lying. He accused her of framing him, despite DNA proving his presence. His own attorneys begged him to stop. They told him, in open court, that his behavior was destroying any chance they had. But he didn't care. The truth was undeniable. The science was airtight, and his meltdown only confirmed to many observers that he had been capable of the cruelty committed in that townhouse all those years ago. When the jury left to deliberate, they took with them some of the most shocking testimony they had ever heard, and after only 5 hours, they returned. They found him guilty, and now the case moved to sentencing, where the drama would escalate even further. When the jury returned their verdict declaring Joseph Zieler guilty of the murders of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and 32-year-old Lisa Story, the courtroom felt suspended in a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Relief because after more than 3 decades, the truth had finally pierced the fog of uncertainty. Disbelief because the man responsible had stood mere feet away from the victims' families, screaming, insulting, lashing out, and acting with absolute disregard for the lives he had destroyed. But the trial was not yet over. In Florida, when prosecutors seek the death penalty, a second stage begins after the guilty verdict. This is the sentencing phase where jurors must decide whether the defendant should live or die. It is often just as emotional, sometimes even more so, than the trial itself. And in the case of Joseph Zieler, it would become one of the most chaotic sentencing phases in recent years. The courtroom gathered once again. Jan sat among supporters, her hands clasped tightly together. Lisa's family members were present too, carrying photographs and wearing expressions shaped by decades of waiting. Reporters filled the benches, attorneys reviewed their notes, and guards stood alert, knowing the defendant's history of unpredictable behavior. When the judge instructed that the sentencing phase would begin, the atmosphere shifted. This was the final battle, the moment when the law would deliver its final answer. The prosecution opened by reminding jurors of the brutality of the crime. They described how Zeeler murdered a child, how he murdered an adult woman who had only been living in the home for 1 week, how he took his time, how he showered afterward, how he left behind signs of staging and psychological manipulation, such as the arranged photographs of Robin. These were not impulsive acts, they argued. These were deliberate choices made by a fully aware, fully capable adult who knew exactly what he was doing and had the opportunity to stop. The prosecution called specialists who testified about the forensic evidence preserved since 1990. They described how carefully the samples had been maintained, how unmistakable the DNA match was, and how impossible it was for Zeeler's loose claim that he had slept with Jan months earlier to explain the biological material found in Robin's body. The jury listened quietly, some taking notes, others staring at the defendant with confusion or disgust. Then the defense began their plea. They argued that Zeeler had suffered through a difficult and strict upbringing. They brought up his father, describing him as harsh and authoritarian. They argued that Zeeler had endured traumatic experiences and that these experiences shaped his adult life. They also introduced claims that Zeeler had suffered a significant memory loss in 1998 after a motorcycle accident. But it became immediately clear that none of these arguments could overcome the cold reality of the forensic evidence. The most advanced DNA testing available had matched Zeeler to the crime scene with absolute certainty. The so-called memory loss could not justify biological material found on an 11-year-old child in 1990. The difficult childhood could not undo the fact that he had washed himself in the victim's home after killing them. And when psychological experts were called to evaluate him, they reached a decisive conclusion. Zeeler was not mentally incompetent. He understood right from wrong. He planned his actions. He was fully capable of making decisions. And the nature of the crimes reflected calculated violence, not the chaotic behavior of someone unable to comprehend their actions. But even as experts testified, even as attorneys laid out their final arguments, the real disruption came from the defendant himself. Throughout the sentencing phase, Zeeler continued the disturbing behavior that had shocked the courtroom earlier. He muttered insults, he glared at jurors, he called the prosecution liars. At one point, he demanded to speak, and when granted the opportunity, he launched into another bizarre rant accusing Jan of framing him, accusing the police of plotting against him, and accusing forensic scientists of planting evidence. His words made no sense. His tone vacillated between angry defiance and mocking disrespect. But then came the moment that left the courtroom stunned. As his own defense attorney, a man who had worked tirelessly to provide him with representation, leaned toward him to clarify a point, Zeeler quickly swung his elbow and struck his lawyer in the head. Gasps filled the room. Security officers surged forward. The judge ordered order in the courtroom while the attorney held his head in shock. It was a surreal scene, almost unimaginable. A defendant who claimed innocence striking the very person responsible for defending him. Yet, remarkably, the attorney chose not to press charges. He told the judge he would continue representing his client. But even he acknowledged that Zeeler had sabotaged any lingering hope of avoiding the most severe sentence. After weeks of emotional testimony, expert analysis, and shocking courtroom behavior, the jury was dismissed to make their final decision. They deliberated. They considered the aggravating factors. They reviewed the brutality of the crime. Other than the death penalty, the only alternative was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Hours later, the jury returned, and their recommendation was delivered. They unanimously supported the death penalty. With this recommendation, the final decision rested with the judge. Florida law requires the judge to give great weight to the jury's findings. In late June of 2023, the courtroom reconvened for the final time. The judge read through the aggravating circumstances, the age of the child victim, the extreme violence, the fact that there were 2 murders, the sexual assault, the staging elements left behind in the home, the cold, calculated nature of the acts. Jan sat quietly, her eyes fixed forward. Lisa's family members leaned forward in their seats. Every person in the courtroom knew what was coming, but hearing the words still carried an emotional weight that pressed into the air. When the judge announced the sentence of death, a wave of stillness moved through the courtroom. Some cried softly, some closed their eyes, some whispered prayers, but no one cheered, no one celebrated. Because in cases like this, victory is never sweet. Justice may be served, but it is a justice that arrives decades too late, delivered to wounds that can never completely heal. Zeeler, however, reacted with defiance. He showed no remorse, no understanding, no acceptance. Even as deputies stood ready to escort him away, he tried once again to confront the courtroom with angry words, but this time the judge ordered him removed. For the Cornell and Story families, this moment was not closure in the traditional sense. There is no closure when you lose a child or a sibling in such a brutal way. But there was a sense of finality, a sense that the wandering years, the decades of waiting, wondering and waking each morning without answers, were finally over. Jan later said she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had spent more than 30 years speaking for Robin because her daughter could no longer speak for herself. And now, after all this time, the truth had finally spoken back. Lisa's family echoed similar sentiments. They thanked investigators and forensic analysts who had preserved every scrap of evidence so carefully, knowing that future technology might one day break the silence. They thanked the jury for their service. They thanked John for her unwavering dedication. And yet, even in this victory, tragedy extended its shadow further. In early 2024, news broke that Zeeler's 32-year-old son was arrested on charges involving illegal materials related to minors. The details stunned many people, raising painful questions about how violence and predatory behavior can ripple across generations, echoing in ways that society cannot easily predict or prevent. While this development was separate from the Cornell and Story case, it added a heartbreaking layer to a story already soaked in tragedy. A father awaiting execution, a son possibly facing years in prison, 2 families shattered by decades-old violence, and 2 innocent victims whose lives ended before they ever truly began. After the sentencing, Zeeler was transferred to death row, where he remains today. His appeals will likely stretch on for years. The appeals process is long, complex, and often frustrating. But the guilty verdict stands, the sentence stands, and the truth, locked in DNA, locked in forensic science, locked in the unwavering determination of families and investigators, can never be erased. As for John, she continues to honor her daughter's memory. She speaks about Robin with the same warmth she used when telling stories of the injured bird Robin nursed back to health, or the afternoons Robin spent laughing with friends. She remembers her daughter's kindness, her love for animals, her gentle nature. Robin's story is now a part of Florida's history. A story of innocence violated, but also a story of resilience, perseverance, and the power of science to resurrect truth even when the trail has long gone cold. And yet, the journey of this documentary is not over, because Part 4 will take us deeper into the broader impact of this case, the community response, the evolution of forensic science, the unanswered questions about Zeeler's past, and the haunting possibility that he may have been responsible for more than anyone realized. The trial of Joseph Zeeler had ended, the jury had spoken, and the judge had delivered Florida's ultimate sentence. Yet, even with the verdict secured and the man convicted, an uncomfortable truth lingered in the air. Justice, in cases like this, does not erase trauma. It does not reset time. It does not undo what happened. It simply marks the end of a story that began more than 3 decades earlier, on a night no one in the Cornell or Story families will ever forget. But the impact of this case stretches far beyond a courtroom. It changed investigators. It changed forensic procedures in the region. It changed how unsolved cases were stored, reviewed, and preserved. It changed how families of missing and murdered children kept hope alive, even when the years turned into decades. And it changed how the community of Cape Coral understood safety, vulnerability, and the quiet presence of danger hiding in plain sight. In the years immediately following the murders of Robin and Lisa, Cape Coral struggled to make sense of what had happened. The town was small enough that news spread quickly. People whispered about the unknown intruder, someone who had slipped inside a neighbor's home, moved silently through bedrooms, smoked cigarettes in the dark, staged family photographs, murdered 2 victims, and then walked away without leaving behind a name. Parents locked doors more tightly. Children were told to stay indoors. Neighbors looked at each other with new suspicion. But as the years passed without an arrest, fear slowly melted into resignation. Life moved on, new families moved in, and those who remembered the murders carried the knowledge quietly. For Jan, the years after the murders were a blur of grief, determination, and relentless searching. She tried to maintain normalcy. She went to work, she spoke to investigators, she gave interviews when asked, she moved homes, unable to bear the screams and memories attached to the townhouse. But the pain followed her everywhere, as grief always does. Lisa's family faced similar battles. Their grief was complicated by the fact that Lisa had only lived with Jan and Robin for 1 week. 1 week, just 7 days. She had moved in to find stability, to share rent, to step into a safer life, but instead, she was murdered by a stranger who had no personal vendetta against her, only a violent impulse he chose not to restrain. For decades, both families questioned not only who had killed their loved ones, but why. Why that house? Why that night? Why Lisa? Why Robin? Why shower afterward? Why move the photos? Why leave cigarette butts and socks behind but take a watch with a personalized engraving? Why leave car keys that led nowhere? And most hauntingly, why had no one heard a thing? Even today, these questions still cast long shadows. Investigators believe the killer staged the scene to confuse, frighten, or taunt. The carefully placed photos suggested he wanted Jan to see them. The cigarette butts implied a disturbing calm. The shower reflected a chilling level of comfort, almost as if he felt he had plenty of time. But in the absence of a confession, the deeper motives remain locked inside the mind of someone who has refused for decades to speak the truth. When DNA finally pulled him out of hiding in 2016, investigators revisited old evidence with new eyes. They wondered whether Zeeler might have been responsible for other crimes in the region: assaults, suspicious break-ins, unsolved attacks, missing children. In many cold case units, it is common to discover that those who kill children have offended before. Some escalate from voyeurism to assault, others from break-ins to violence. The fear among investigators was that the murders of Robin and Lisa might not have been his first act of brutality. Detectives examined older cases, comparing timelines, geographic locations, and behavioral patterns. But so far, no confirmed link has been established between Zeeler and other homicides. Still, the possibility remains open. Investigators have publicly stated they believe Zeeler may have committed additional crimes that simply have not yet been connected to him. If true, the truth might someday emerge, just as the truth of Robin and Lisa's case emerged after 26 years. Meanwhile, forensic science continued to evolve. The Cornell and Story case became an example frequently discussed at law enforcement conferences, particularly in conversations about evidence preservation and long-term storage. The biological samples collected in 1990 had been carefully sealed, documented, and preserved by early-generation forensic technicians who understood that someday someone might be able to do more with the evidence than they could at the time. Those technicians likely did not know how advanced DNA testing would become, or that minute samples preserved under ideal conditions could still yield profiles decades later. Yet their meticulous work became the foundation upon which modern investigators solved one of the most haunting crimes in Florida's history. And in many ways, this case served as a reminder of how science can speak long after witnesses forget, long after suspects leave town, long after hope seems to fade. It also reminded law enforcement agencies of a critical truth. Cold cases are not dead cases. They are waiting cases, sleeping cases, cases where time might destroy hope but preserve evidence. Each year, more families across the country find answers through DNA technology, answers that their loved ones did not live to see, answers that arrived during a decade when no one expected progress, answers that finally reveal the name of the person who stole a life decades earlier. The arrest of Joseph Zeeler became part of that growing pattern, and it reignited the public's interest in cold cases, genetic genealogy, and the role forensic science plays in solving crimes that once seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. But while the science behind the case was extraordinary, the human impact was even more profound. When Jeanne spoke after the verdict, she did not speak with triumph. She spoke with tenderness, with heartbreak, with love for her daughter. She described Robin's compassion, her energy, her innocence. She spoke about how Robin cared for animals, how she made friends easily, how she brought light into every room. And Lisa's loved ones spoke similarly about Lisa's kindness, her caring nature, her dedication to friendship and family, and the life she was building before it was violently cut short. Even in death, both victims left behind a legacy of love that endured longer than the life of the man responsible. And that alone speaks to something larger than justice. It speaks to memory, to resilience, and to the powerful desire of families to ensure that victims are more than statistics or cold case numbers. They are real people, forever remembered. As news of the conviction spread through Florida, the community reflected on how much time had passed. Children who were not yet born in 1990 were adults in 2023. The townhouse complex where the murders occurred had changed residents many times. Some who lived there in 1990 had moved away long ago, carrying with them the memory of that horrible morning when Jan's screams echoed through the neighborhood. Others had grown up never knowing what had happened, only learning pieces of the story through documentaries, news coverage, or social media. But justice has a long tail. It reaches backward, reclaiming forgotten details. It reaches forward, preventing future crimes. And it reaches across generations, giving families the answers they waited decades to receive. Yet even with the guilty verdict delivered, another disturbing chapter unfolded when news emerged in early 2024 about Zeeler's 32-year-old son. His arrest for possessing illegal materials involving minors sent shockwaves through the community. While his charges were unrelated to Robin and Lisa's case, the news intensified public scrutiny on the broader patterns of abuse within the Zeeler family. Some asked whether violence or predatory behavior was learned, inherited, or shaped by environment. Others wondered whether the family's history contained deeper, darker stories that had never been told publicly. While none of these questions have confirmed answers, the eerie parallels between father and son created a haunting echo. Still, for the Cornell and Story families, the focus remained on the truth, the DNA, the evidence, the verdict, and the knowledge that the person who killed Robin and Lisa would never be free again. And yet, the story is not finished, because Part 4 does not end with the trial. It ends with the echoes of everything left behind, the aftermath, the lessons, the societal shifts, and the long shadow a crime like this casts far beyond the walls of a courtroom. The murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story represent more than one tragic night. They represent the intersection of community trust, forensic science, human resilience, generational trauma, and the unrelenting impact of grief. To understand the full weight of this case, one must look not only at what happened in that townhouse, but at what happened afterwards, how families grappled with loss, how investigators refused to give up, how society evolved, and how the story of two victims continues to resonate today. In the years following the murders, Jeanne faced the near-impossible task of rebuilding her life. She continued working at the hospital, surrounded by the sterile lights and quiet hallways that sometimes reminded her of the frantic night she ran to the phone to call for help. She moved homes, changed routines, and learned how to live with the empty space where her daughter once laughed, talked, and dreamed. But she never abandoned Robin's memory. She kept her daughter's belongings preserved with care. She kept photographs safe. She kept letters, school projects, drawings, and the everyday mementos that only become priceless after tragedy. She became an advocate for her daughter's case, speaking to reporters, meeting with investigators, and participating in documentaries that aim to keep Robin's name alive in the public consciousness. Every interview was emotional, but every interview also served a purpose. It reminded the world that Robin was not a forgotten victim. She was a little girl with a future stolen. Lisa's family faced their own path of grief. They had welcomed news of her living arrangements with relief, believing she had moved into a safe and stable home. The idea that she was murdered not by a partner, an acquaintance, or a known enemy, but by a complete stranger, made the loss even harder to accept. Her sister described the pain of not knowing for so many years, of wondering every night who had taken Lisa's life. She described searching for answers that never seemed to come, fighting to keep Lisa's case from fading into obscurity. To her, the reopening of the case in 2005 and again in later years represented moments of renewed hope, but also renewed grief as the wounds resurfaced every time. The community's response evolved over time. During the early years, the murders were a source of fear. Many parents worried that the killer could strike again. Others questioned whether the home had been specifically targeted or chosen randomly. Rumors spread, theories circulated, and some people who lived near the townhouse during the early 1990s moved away, unable to shake the memory of that traumatic night. But as years passed and no new attacks occurred, the fear shifted into something quieter, lingering sadness and confusion, mixed with a fragile hope that someday answers would come. Those answers eventually arrived through the unexpected arrest in 2016, and with that arrest came renewed scrutiny of older forensic practices. The Cornell and Story case demonstrated a powerful truth. Evidence properly collected and preserved can solve crimes even decades later. This led to renewed emphasis across the state of Florida on maintaining chain of custody protocols, updating evidence storage standards, and encouraging cold case units to resubmit older biological samples as new forensic technologies emerged. It also led some departments to apply for grants that funded advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy programs that have since helped solve numerous other cold cases throughout the state. The case also sparked discussions about surveillance, home security, and neighborhood awareness. In 1990, home security systems were far less common. Few people had alarm systems. Even fewer had cameras. Today, millions of homes across the country use doorbell cameras, motion sensor lights, and digital locks. Some attribute this cultural shift to increased public awareness about how quickly danger can enter even communities considered safe. What happened in Jan's townhouse could have happened anywhere. It could have happened in another state, another decade, another family. And that universality made the story even more chilling. But even within darkness, there is the light of resilience. Both families demonstrated extraordinary strength. For more than 3 decades, they refused to let time bury the victims' names. They spoke out. They shared memories. They trusted investigators. And they held on to a fragile hope that justice, however delayed, would eventually arrive. Their perseverance became a symbol of something larger, the belief that truth cannot be erased by time, and that even cases left cold for decades can still find resolution. Today, Zeeler sits on death row, awaiting the long series of appeals that accompany such a sentence. The appeals process may take many years, some appeals may be denied quickly, others may require extended reviews. But regardless of how long the legal process continues, one fact remains unchangeable. His DNA was there, on Robin's pillow, on her bedding, in her room, in her body. No courtroom performance, no insult, no denial, no accusation can undo that. Science stripped away the lies he attempted to construct and revealed what he tried desperately to hide. There are still unanswered questions. Why did he choose that house? Did he know Jan? Did he stalk the home? Was he responsible for other crimes? Why take the engraved watch? Why stage the photos? Why leave the Toyota keys? Why shower after the murders? Why stay the amount of time he stayed? And what motivated him to return to normal life afterward as if nothing had happened? Without a confession, these questions may never be fully answered, and perhaps for the families, knowing why does not matter as much as knowing who. Because for 33 years, the lack of a name was the greatest torment of all. Now that name is known, justice has taken its course, and the two victims who lived gentle and loving lives are remembered today not for how they died, but for who they were. Robin Cornell, a bright, compassionate 11-year-old who loved animals, made friends easily, and carried a warmth that touched everyone she met. Lisa Story, a devoted friend, a gentle soul, and a caring woman who had only begun to build the next chapter of her life when it was tragically taken from her. Their lives mattered, their stories matter. And through the combined work of families, investigators, forensic scientists, and the slow but inevitable march of justice, their truths have finally been brought into the light. Before we close this case, I want to thank you for joining Dark Case Desk as we honor their memories. If you found value in this documentary, please like this video, comment your thoughts below, and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and ensures victims are never forgotten. And with that, we bring the story of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story to its final chapter, not an ending defined by darkness, but by truth, remembrance, and the unwavering strength of those who refuse to let justice fade. Thank you for watching.